Hello there, it's time for circulatory system. See, they stole my idea about Valentine's cards. That's no fair. I thought that was just my idea. Here we go. So, there's a lot of other stuff we can study here too, because this is a lot about diffusion, right? Every one of your cells, just like you as a whole, needs to get stuff in and get stuff out, right? A lot of the way that happens is by diffusion, but diffusion is very slow. If you do this math here, right, it's very, very slow. So basically, every cell in your body needs to be only two cells at the most away from that kind of blood vessel, a capillary, that things can get out of and diffuse to it. That's about as far away as any cell in your body can be from a capillary. That should tell you, if you think about it, how vast your circulatory system is. Like if you put all your vessels end to end, it would go to the moon and back or something like that, right? So here we have a little bit of red ink. That means need to know. We're going to look at this in a separate kind of unit, but some of it applies here as we go through these systems. So they're going to want you to be able to identify phylums. These would be the names of phylums of animals, okay? And then even, as we'll see in a little bit, even some classes of, um, of animals that are the kind that we call chordata, and those classes would be more familiar to you. Those are reptiles, mammals, amphibians. So we'll get to those in a minute. But recognition features of those, and then recognition features expected for the selected animal phyla. Those are those that are most useful in distinguishing the groups from each other. Full descriptions are not needed. I wish they would have given us a list, right? Instead of that very vague, the most useful, because that's kind of subjective. But anyway, I'm going to give it a shot. So here's one group that's in there. Cnidarians is how you pronounce that. I think this is like jellyfish, okay? Jellyfish, coral, hydra, Portuguese man of war, they all fit into this phylum, and that's a name that's in your little list here, right? So what's the deal with them compared to the other phylum? Well, one of them is that they don't have like blood vessel kind of things, but they do have a system of tubes, and this kind of also segues into their digestive tract system, which is also a system of tubes, right? And their excretory system, which, like your kidneys, are also a system of tubes. There's all kinds of tubes everywhere of all different kinds, okay? So if we look at a jellyfish like this, we see that it's got a mouth, just like you and I, and that mouth is the opening of a tube that then branches into a whole bunch of other little tubes. So we have branching here doing what? Increasing surface area, right? The surface of these tubes, its food is going to go in, the water is going to go in, the oxygen that's in the water is going to go in, right? So these kind of things get all the nutrients and water and oxygen and things to their cells in a very unique kind of way, as well as this system of tubes. The walls of these jellyfish are only 2 cells thick. Only 2 cells thick. And then they secrete a lot of jelly in that part, but that jelly doesn't need any of these nutrients. It's just jelly, and it serves to help them float. So living cell-wise, the ones that needs nutrients, their whole body, the walls of these tubes, the walls of the tentacles that hang down from them, only 2 cells thick. And diffusion is fast enough to go that 2 cells, like we already said. So anyway, this also, separates them from other animals in terms of their digestive system, because they only have one opening. They don't have two openings that connect a tube like you and I. They only have one. So the food comes in there like a little fish that a jellyfish might capture, for instance, or any other kind of thing. and they try to digest it. Some of the parts that don't get digested, they poop it right back up their mouth, right? Almost like eating and then throwing up, kind of the same kind of thing. So here's a kind of worm called a flatworm. There are lots of kinds of worms. The ones you're probably most familiar with are, earthworms, but they belong to a different phylum that we'll get to next. This kind of worm called platyhelminths, that was the word in your list, so you need to know that word. They're also more commonly known as flatworms. This is a common kind called a planaria. These are little, about a half an inch or less, and they're cute little guys because they're cross-eyed, as you can see. So they also have this two-way digestive tract. Two-way means food comes in this way and then the waste go out that way, two ways. Whereas you're in my tube, unless you throw up, food only goes one way and then it never comes back that same way in the tube. So here you see the same kind of plan that has evolved. This should not surprise you evolution-wise. This tube then branches, 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 branches. And because their body is so flat and they have all these branches, every one of their living cells is again no more than 2 cells away from the outside where they can get oxygen to them, and from one of these branches where they can get other nutrients like glucose and amino acids that's coming from their lunch. So the arthropods, which includes insects and crabs and things like that, and most but not all mollusks. These are 2 more phylums. I put them all in red ink, right? They have a kind of circulatory system that's called open, but they have a circulatory system that has those vessels that we commonly call arteries and veins maybe, and they have that thing called a heart which pumps them, and that's what those other things, those flatworms and those cnidarians, they didn't have that. So that's one difference. But you can see here, unlike what we'll see in you and I, when their heart contracts, and it's made of muscle that contracts, it pumps blood, and then that blood just spills out. And we don't even call it blood, even though it's not the worst mistake. It doesn't have any blood cells, and so we gave it a different name, hemolymph, right? And so what happens here with this spilled out blood is it just very sloppily but effectively bathes all of the other living cells and brings them nutrients, which include again lunch nutrients and also some oxygen kind of things. Although we're going to get to a different story with insects as far as oxygen goes. So anyway, it slops around all over their cells, and then it's got some short vessels that as it squishes around, it'll squish them back into the heart. So this is a circulatory system, but it's not what we call closed. In other words, the blood doesn't stay in vessels all the way from the heart back to the heart. That's what we would call closed, and that's what you and I have. So clams and oysters have this kind of system, insects, crustaceans, those kind of arthropods, spiders. So now we get to the more sophisticated, we like to think, closed circulatory system, and here we see another kind of worm that's quite more complicated than the flatworms, because these have a system of closed tubes, which means they have the 3 kind of blood vessels, I'll go ahead and say it here, that you need to be able to identify. And their name and identification is based on the direction of blood relative to the heart. If they're a vessel that takes blood away from the heart, that's A for away and A for artery. If they're a very small branch of those arteries, where stuff is going out because their walls are so thin and stuff is going in, which would be like waste going in, nutrients going out. Those are called capillaries. And then on the other side of that capillary bed, you would call this, is the vessel that we now say is bringing blood back to the heart, and those are called veins. So whether that blood has a lot of oxygen in it, nutrients in it, that's not how we define them as arteries, capillaries, and veins. It's their position relative to the heart and the blood that they carry through them. Okay, so anyway, this was in that list. This is the phylum name for that earthworms belong to, and a bunch of other worms too, but earthworms most familiar. Then we have, these are mollusks. These are the mollusks that also have a much a higher nervous system and brain. They're pretty smart mollusks, but they have a closed circulatory system. And so this is a great example of divergent evolution, right? From a common mollusk ancestor, we have the kinds with an open system, like clams and oysters, and we have kinds that in their own separate evolutionary path evolved this closed circulatory system. And then we have the ones that we belong to, the big group called Chordata. The subphylum is Vertebrata, right? And but Chordata was in your list of need to know phylum names, right? So you need to know that. And all of these things have a closed circulatory system. Okay, so far so good. So here we now differentiate. Here's this one. They want you to be able to recognize the features of birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish, but they don't tell us what features. So this is one feature that you could distinguish between them, and that is how many chambers are in their heart. Because we already said they're all chordates, and so they all have a closed circulatory system, all these things, right? But some of the groups have a different number of chambers in their heart than others, the two chambers that we call ventricles and atria. Okay, we might as well, identify them while we're at it. So the atria is a Latin word that means entranceway. If you have an atrium at your house or some building, that's where like the front door is. And ventricle, I don't know the origin of that word, but that's the part that when it contracts, its muscular walls contract, it shoots blood away from the heart. The atrium is where blood enters the heart. That means that blood is coming into the atrium from veins, and it's leaving out of the ventricle from arteries. And somewhere in between the arteries and the veins, there's going to be a lot of branching and capillaries. Okay, so fish have just two chambers, one atrium and one ventricle. All right. Amphibians have three. They have one big ventricle and two atria, and this helps keep the blood that's got a lot of oxygen in it a little bit separate from the blood that has not much oxygen in it. So here's how that works with capillaries, and we'll get into this more with gas exchange, so I'm just going to be real fast. If you're a frog, a grown-up frog, you have lungs, but your skin also has a lot of capillaries, and you pick up oxygen in both places. So when this blood comes out of your heart, specifically the ventricle part, right, it goes into those capillaries in both your lung and your skins, picks up a lot of oxygen. Red is always the oxygen color in these diagrams, right? Even though your test is going to be black and white. In textbooks and things, you see red. So that means it's got a lot of oxygen. This oxygenated blood comes back, and then it gets pumped out to all those other tissues in the body, like those in the liver, muscles, brain, all those tissues that need oxygen. And in capillaries in those tissues, they lose that oxygen. The blood does. It diffuses out, diffuses into all those other cells, and that's why it doesn't have much oxygen as it's on its way back. Now, if you look at this ventricle, what has been accomplished here by having two separate atrium is at least a little bit of separation between oxygenated blood and non-oxygenated, which is better for efficiency, right? So if mostly oxygenated blood is going to these tissues, that sets the stage for greater diffusion, because this is all concentration gradient diffusion stuff too. Okay, so amphibians, three-chambered heart, fish, two-chambered heart, those are across the board definites. But now reptiles are a little more confusing, kind of. Reptiles, some of them have a three-chambered heart like their amphibian ancestors, and some of them have a four-chambered heart, right? Kind of like the division of the mollusks and the other between the mollusks that we talked about before. So the double circulatory system of crocodilian type reptiles, but not like lizards and snakes. They have a three-chambered heart. Birds and mammals, which remember evolved from reptiles, right? Those three groups evolved a four-chambered heart where simply the ventricle is also divided into two, and we have a more complete separation of oxygenated blood coming in this case from the lungs, and going out to all of the other capillaries that are collectively called the systemic circuit, because this is the rest of the system, right? And so in a little bit also, we're going to focus on the heart itself, and we're going to see that, the heart needs more oxygen than any other of your organs because it is so active, and it's got little vessels that take blood right back to it with a lot of oxygen out of that system. Okay, so here in red, they say that, and this was true for the amphibians also, there's a separate circulation to the lungs and back to the heart, and to the rest of the body, which we just again said was called systemic, back to the heart. That's double circulation. Okay, pulmonary is the lung word, and so since cardio is the heart word, this system is often referred to as the cardiopulmonary system, involving the heart and the lungs and all that stuff. And we'll come back to that when we get to focus more on lungs and gas exchange. Okay, so here's a connection with something else. If you have a four-chambered heart that's more efficiently delivering oxygen to your cells because it keeps separate the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, right? If you have a four-chambered heart, that oxygen can support more Krebs cycles and respiration reactions, right? To recharge more ATPs, to keep you endothermic and more active. You can generate more heat in order to be active, which is a lot of muscle contraction. They have to be pretty warm, right? The the cost of this is you have to eat more, but this is the kind of creature that you and I are. Okay, they just stick these things in here every now and then. This is a kind of a nature of science kind of thing. Theories are regarded as uncertain. I don't like the way they put that. Theories, again, are very well supported explanations for phenomena in the universe. Uncertain, I don't like that word, but the idea is that a good scientist will never say, I know this 100% for sure, because that's a little egotistical to think that you know everything there is possible to know about anything. So I think that's why they threw that in there. And in this case, this involves theories about circulation in the heart, and through blood vessels, that this guy is given credit for the basic idea of circulation, that it's the same blood that just keeps going around and around, and like you don't like make new blood all the time and whatever. So